So to say that I've been sent down the Sumire pipeline recently is, it's kind of an understatement. See, because I was recently sent an email with a screenshot of a Reddit post, something that happens quite often. And in this Reddit post, somebody by the name of Borosumi was talking about how it's a possibility that Sumire and Boruto have been communicating over the span of the time skip through Nue. Basically saying that the reason that Boruto knew that Sumire was unaffected by omnipotence, even though he was never explicitly told, is because him and Sumire have been communicating through the medium of Nue that both of them can summon. It's not the fact that in episode 4 of Boruto, which is canon, Boruto summons Nue because he tries to use a summoning jutsu without a previous contract form with any other summoning animals. Now, we've already broken down this theory and talked about it. And basically, we came to the conclusion that Boruto and Sumire almost definitely weren't using Nue as a way to communicate during the time skip. However, there is technically a possibility that they may do it in the future, as it seems much more likely to me, now that it seems as though Sarada is going to leave the village with Boruto, that Sumire will be the last mole in Konoha that Boruto and Sarada can communicate with. But because yesterday when I was filming that video, I got curious about what Borosumi was up to on Reddit, I decided to look up their username. And once again, while I was baffled by the amount of love for Sumire, they have a couple of good theories, and thus, much to my surprise, as I was trying to find some more substantiating arguments to back up Boruto and Sumire possibly communicating over the time skip, I stumbled upon an additional theory that Borosumi created that is objectively better than the first one, because this theory, unlike our previous theory, doesn't really have any logical fallacies. It answers the how, it answers the why, and it answers the when. And more than that, it passes the cool factor, because this theory, unlike the previous one, doesn't assume that Boruto once again summoned Nue just because he figured that Sumire was unaffected by omnipotence, and then used Nue to pass a message to Sumire because somehow he had the information that Sumire was unaffected by omnipotence and would help him. And no, instead this theory dives into one of the deepest and darkest corners in all of Boruto, Amado, and tries to answer some of the lingering questions revolving around that deep, dark corner. And not only a way that makes sense, but also in a way that Kishimoto would write things. That's because today we're talking about the theory, is Amado planning on using Sumire to bring back his daughter? Yes, that's right, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're talking implanting karma marks on unsuspecting girls. Something that could be right up Amado's alley, or something he wouldn't even dream of doing. Unfortunately, we don't really know because Amado's a giant question mark. But today we're going to be giving you all the information possible on this theory so you can make your own opinion. But before we get to info dumping, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you like the idea of me info dumping on all your other favorite anime and manga, go ahead and follow my other channel, The Weeb Commander, where instead of talking about Naruto and Boruto, I talk all other anime and manga. And if you want to see me try to bring anime to real life, guys, go ahead and follow my brand new challenge page that I'm doing with Chris Barnett, Stephen He, and Danny Mata called Anime IRL, where we try to take challenges to the world of anime. Or if you just want to hear me talk about anime, go ahead and follow my anime podcast, Talkers Anonymous, where me and Danny Mata break down everything that happened in anime and manga this week. It's available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. But before we get into all that, today we got to talk about our favorite recurring sponsor to the page, DraftKings Casino. I've teamed up with DraftKings to bring real money casino games straight to your fingertips. DraftKings Casino allows you to choose from over 300 real money games, all from the comfort of your home. Whether it be slots, roulette, blackjack, or live dealer games, DraftKings Casino has you covered. And with more real money games being added every single day, DraftKings Casino is changing the game with new ways to play. But more than that, DraftKings is safe, secure, and reliable. And considering the fact that DraftKings has already awarded over $100 million in jackpot winnings, I'd reckon the people who have walked away with those big earnings would probably attest to those points. If DraftKings Casino isn't in your state yet, check out DraftKings Daily Fantasy app, where you can have a shot at winning cash prizes all season long. So what are you waiting for? Download the DraftKings Casino app today and sign up using promo code NCHammer. And when you do, if you play just $5, you will get $50 in casino credits immediately. Who knew you could have this much fun at home? So, when it comes down to it, Boruto has a ton of lingering questions in the story that have yet to be resolved. Why does Boruto know so much about the Shinju? Does Momoshiki have a future sight ability? Who is she by? And what's going on with Amado? Unfortunately, out of all of those questions, the question of what's going on with Amado basically has the least answers. All we know about Amado is that at one point he was central in Kara. However, Amado's key goal in Kara was to destroy it, and more specifically, to destroy Ishiki. At least that's what we've been told. See, because, well, yes, technically Amado was a mole inside of Kara and created Kashin Koji specifically to destroy Jigen. Amado's overall goals are hazy. One, because we as Naruto fans have been taught to not trust scientist types in the Naruto universe, and two, because he's intentionally vague about basically everything. And thus, when it really boils down to it, anything that Amado tells us, we have a hard time believing. However, the one thing that the Boruto fandom seems to agree on, at least so far as what Amado has told us, is that Amado's desire to re-implant a karma on Kawaki is based on the fact that Amado has placed the chakra and DNA of his daughter, Akebi, in said karma marking. And thus, if hypothetically Kawaki is to implant his karma marking in a vessel that accepts his karma marking, then slowly but surely that karma marking will embed into that person's body and download Akebi's DNA and personality. Until eventually, much like how Ishiki burst out of Jigen, Akebi will basically burst out of whatever human this is implanted on. And thus basically the only real reason that Boruto has ever given us as to why Amado is such an incredible scientist is because he's been desperately looking for a way to bring his daughter back to life. And the research he's done into the karma marking isn't the only path he's pursued in bringing Akebi back to life, as Amado has also very notably learned cloning and cyborg technology to possibly bring some version of Akebi back. We know this because Amado has explained to us how Delta came to be, and how Delta was originally supposed to be a cybernetic replacement for Akebi. However, Delta didn't turn into the Akebi he remembered, and Amado tells us that every new iteration of Delta is further and further away from the Akebi he remembers. And thus, if Amado wasn't going to be able to bring back his daughter through cyborg technology, wanted to say like cyborgism, then he was gonna have to look for different avenues. And this is roughly, I imagine, around the time that Jigen came into his life and introduced to him the karma marking, a technique that would allow for Akebi to take over somebody else's body and simply return on Earth. And thus from this moment on, Amado committed his entire life to figuring out the secret of the karma marking, something that he's now done, to the point now where he was able to reverse engineer Ishiki's karma marking and place it back on Kawaki with none of Ishiki's ego or consciousness or even chakra tied into the karma marking, meaning that Kawaki would be able to use all of the power of Ishiki without the possibility of Ishiki taking over his body, which is obviously key because, like we've already established, Amado had two goals: killing Ishiki and getting his daughter back. Two things that he hopes to accomplish through the medium of Kawaki. However, rather interestingly, he doesn't necessarily have a vessel for that karma marking to be placed onto. Well, that's not entirely true. See, the long-term idea from Amado is for Kawaki to implant a karma marking on Delta, because while Delta is a genetic copy of Akebi, she doesn't have Akebi's soul. And thus, because Amado is the creator of Delta, I guess he believes it's within his rights to override her entire personality with the personality of his dead daughter. And there actually is some evidence to prove that this has already kind of begun to happen. See, Delta in Two Blue Vortex has been flying basically everywhere, right alongside Kawaki. However, the way that Delta is flying is different from the way that she flew in part 1 of Boruto. See, because in part 1 of Boruto, when we're first introduced to the Delta clone that is eventually destroyed by Naruto, said Delta clone, whose entire body is made out of shinobi-wear augmentations, is changing her feet into basically jet propulsion engines. And thus, at any time that Delta flies in part 1 of Boruto, the best examples being her battle against Naruto, we can see that there is a stream of flames coming out from the bottom of her feet. Kind of like Iron Man, she's turning her feet into jet propulsion engines that allows her to fly basically however she wants. However, rather interestingly, by the time the Two Blue Vortex comes around, that is, after the time skip, Delta no longer needs to turn her feet into jet propulsion engines to fly. She flies basically in the exact same capacity as Kawaki or Boruto or any other Otsutsuki. That is to say that she flies like Superman, no jet propulsion needed. But that's interesting, because while sure, obviously Naruto destroyed the Delta clone that was using jet propulsion feet, and thus technically the Delta that we have now in Two Blue Vortex is a different Delta than the one that we had in part 1 of Boruto, Amado never says that this Delta is an upgrade from the last one. So far as we understand, there's basically just multiple different Deltas around that the chip that carries Delta's personality, information, and abilities can plug itself into the backup. And thus, a lot of theorists in the Boruto space believe that during the time skip, Kawaki implanted his karma marking on Delta, and that while she may not be 100% Otsutsufied yet, her being able to fly like an Otsutsuki is evidence of the fact that she's beginning to be Otsutsufied. Now really, the only problem with this line of thinking is the fact that she has no karma marking, at least so far as we know. See, because here's the thing about Delta, her character design actually lends to blocking a karma marking quite well. Delta wears rather interesting sleeves, the kind of sleeves that have a piece of fabric that run between these two fingers. Now, rather interestingly, the iteration of Delta that we knew in part 1 of Boruto didn't have these hand sleeves. And while a lot of characters in the Boruto universe got overhauls to their looks, the fact that her hands went from uncovered to covered during the time skip could definitely lead to some curiosity. And this isn't the only cosmetic change between the first Delta and the new Delta. See, because while triangles are definitely nothing new to Delta, in fact, the majority of her character design is built around triangles because Delta is a Greek triangle. Well, Delta is a Greek letter in the alphabet, and its symbol is that of a triangle. Delta in part 1 of Boruto had a very tight isosceles triangle on her forehead that looked kind of like a Roman numeral 1, and the Delta that we now have in Two Blue Vortex has a very standard triangle that's also kind of like a swirl. And thus, there is some key characteristic differences between part 1 Delta and Two Blue Vortex Delta. And this would kind of makes sense. See, because we know for a fact that Amado placed his karma marking on Kawaki in order to have Kawaki place that karma marking on Delta. And thus there's really no reason for us to assume that over the course of that 3-year time skip, Amado never walked up to Kawaki and was like, hey man, can we get this done already? Because here's the thing. Well, you can obviously make the argument that Amado was affected by omnipotence like everybody else, and he maybe was. Now I say maybe was because once again, we can never be for sure with anything with Amado. But even if Amado was affected by omnipotence, we know from recent events in Two Blue Vortex that he's figured out that his memories were altered. He's figured out that there's no scientific or logical way to explain the fact that Kawaki has a karma marking that he created, even though he believes he gave a karma marking to Boruto and doesn't remember giving one to Kawaki. And Amado revealing this fleshed out theory to Sumire in casual conversation means he's probably known about it for a little while. And the thing about omnipotence is the further you get away from the event day of omnipotence being released, the stronger the effect gets, which means that if Amado was able to break out of omnipotence 3 years later, that he actually probably broke out of it a little bit earlier than that. In fact, you can make the argument that within the first couple of days of omnipotence, Amado probably figured out that his memories had been altered. However, as it currently stands, Amado doesn't necessarily have any reason to believe that Kawaki and Ada would be the person who altered his memories. And thus, there's not necessarily anything stopping Amado from going up to Kawaki and saying, why do you have a karma marking that I created? And if I gave you a karma marking that I created, shouldn't it have my daughter's DNA in it? And thus there is a fair amount of possibility that Amado not only would have figured out that Kawaki has the karma marking with the Kebi's data, but also would have asked Kawaki to use that karma marking to implant on a newly cloned version of Delta. But you could absolutely at the same time make the argument that Amado hasn't done this. You can make the argument that Amado made this Kawaki-based karma marking observation recently, and that Amado, being the incredibly intelligent man that he is, has some kind of sneaking suspicion that Kawaki, the person who seems to be unaffected or be the outlier in his memories equations, could be the person responsible for the fact that his memories are all scrambled. And thus going up to said person and revealing yourself as somebody unaffected by this possible worldwide memory altering swap could be incredibly dangerous. But this does leave us with some questions of why the version of Delta we currently have is so different from the version of Delta we had in part 1 of Boruto. Because not only is this version of Delta able to fly without jet propulsion, but also the temperament of this Delta seems to be much more delicate. See, well, obviously, version 2 of Delta still cusses out Kawaki basically any chance she gets, calling him shitwalkie and other things like that. This version of Delta is also very close friends with Ada and makes sure she's okay after Kawaki is mean to her. This version of Delta checks in with Kawaki when he's flying back into a battle against Jura and asks him, are you sure you're going to be able to take Jura on? He kind of just kicked your teeth down your throat. See, while we don't get a ton of time with version 1 of Delta, basically everything that ever came out of version 1 of Delta's mouth was incredibly aggressive and not at all considerate of other people's feelings. While the Delta that we currently have in Two Blue Vortex, while she isn't the biggest fan of Kawaki, seems to be considerate of basically everybody else. And honestly, with the way that Kawaki treats everybody in Konoha, genuinely, who can blame her for being mean to only him? But what if the real reason that this version 2 of Delta is so different from version 1 of Delta is because she's version 2 of Delta? What if only being able to fly through the means of chakra-fueled jet propulsion was too chakra depleted, and therefore Amado just reverse engineered Otsutsuki flight and put it in the newer editions of Delta? That's a solid possibility. I mean, after all, it has been 3 years. That's a lot of time for somebody like Amado to perfect some cyborgs. And if we move forward to the assumption that Amado hasn't had Kawaki place his karma marking on Delta, we can get into the meat of the theory proposed by Borosumi. See, because basically any way you look at it, the relationship between Sumire and Amado is odd. See, Sumire has never been much of a fighter. While she was in the Shinobi Academy with the rest of the new, I don't remember how many of them there is, like Konoha 6, Boruto, Sarada, Mitsuki, Metal Lee, Cho-Cho, Inojin, Shikadai. Konoha 7. Oh, Nick, what about Awabi and Denki and Wasabi? They don't count. You know they don't count. They're basically not in the manga. But anyways, it's established pretty early on in the story that Sumire is not a fighter, and thus she joins Katsuki's team. Sorry, Katasuke. I forget his name literally every time. Now, Katasuke, by the time that Boruto comes around, is pretty much Konoha's premier scientist, as he is, after all, the person who made the Shinobi Gauntlet. And thus, pretty much fresh out of the Shinobi Academy, Sumire decides to join his team and help him creating Shinobi Wear projects. However, by the time that chapter 56 rolls around and Amado's introduced to Konoha, Sumire decides to jump ship from Katasuke to Amado. Now, all of this is revealed after Kawaki loses his arm protecting Himawari and Boruto from Delta 1. And thus, Sumire has made actually a pretty impressive career move by going from a really good scientist to a much better scientist. However, Sumire isn't trying to train under Amado to become the greatest scientist of all time. No, in fact, she only joins Amado's team to spy on him. And she reveals that literally 3 chapters after becoming his assistant. See, after Amado has the first conversation with Kawaki about implanting a karma marking on him that's purely a weapon, Sumire, who's I guess not super used to the moral grays of Amado's science, asks what his intentions are with Kawaki. And it's at this point that Amado immediately deduces that Sumire decided to become his personal assistant so she could spy on him, as he goes so far as to ask if Shikamaru put you up to this. Now, it's at this point that Sumire asks the really good question, is it true that you only want to give Kawaki back his karma marking so that he's more powerful than Code? Which earns Sumire a very disgusted or intrigued side-eye from Amado. Now, it's a couple of pages after this that Sumire and Amado continue their conversation, where Sumire is telling Amado that she became his personal assistant of her own free will. Shikamaru had nothing to do with it, but that she did become his personal assistant because she was concerned about Boruto and Kawaki's well-being. Now, to this point that Amado tells her that he always knew that she joined him to spy on him. And he told her that if she had just stayed quiet a little bit longer, she would have been able to get more information out of him. Now, this conversation continues on in the next chapter, where Sumire asks Amado if he's going to hurt Konoha, to which he responds by saying, no, he's not going to hurt Konoha. In fact, the human-sized capsule he has in his lab is eventually going to be a very powerful ally to Konoha. We now know that that human-sized capsule was just Delta Part 2. But this conversation does reveal that simply days into Sumire being Amado's lab assistant, that Amado knew that Sumire was spying on him. And yet, 3 years later, post-time skip, Sumire is still working with Amado. That's odd. See, while Amado is an intelligent person and therefore understands that Konoha is never going to fully trust him and is therefore always going to spy on him in some capacity, like the fact that Shikamaru actively has microphones and cameras in Amado's laboratory that allowed for Shikamaru to realize that his memories had also been altered, actively allowing somebody to study under you who's already admitted to be spying on you is kind of crazy, especially when you consider the fact that Amado still continually info dumps to Sumire, which is how Shikamaru was able to become aware of the fact that his memories had been altered, because Amado was explaining to Sumire why he believed his memories had been altered. So why would somebody as cautious and clever as Amado allow for Sumire to exist within his fold? And the only answer that a lot of people can come to is that Amado is allowing her to exist within his folds for a reason. But what is that reason? Well, in chapter 75, Amado reveals that he plans on having Kawaki implant a karma on a newly created clone. And while Borosumi says that Amado hasn't been seen working on a clone, yes, he has. It's Delta. They literally point out the giant capsule in chapter 59, or I think it's chapter 60, but still, there is no technical evidence at this point that Delta has been given a karma marking. And there's also technically no evidence that Delta would be able to survive a karma marking implantation process. However, Sumire, who's already survived having the Gozo Tenno inscribed on her back, could very easily be considered a fantastic candidate for receiving a karma marking. See, because, well, technically, the Gozo Tenno and the karma marking operate in very different capacities. The fact that Sumire's body was strong enough to act as a doorway between the underworld where Nue exists and the real world, by having her have the Gozo Tenno inscribed on her back and therefore being the bridge between those two worlds, that's not crazy to assume that the karma marking, which is also a diamond, just like the Gozo Tenno, would have a higher chance of success if implanted on Sumire as opposed to possibly Delta 2.0. And therefore, the possible explanation as to why Amado allows for Sumire to stick around even though he knows she's spying on him is that she could be a potential backup candidate for the revival of Akebi. On top of this, Sumire and Akebi's names have a fair amount of connection. See, sumire is the Japanese word for magenta. And while a lot of you might go, well, yeah, that's because she has purple hair. I mean, yeah, that's definitely a part of it. However, the word in akebi references a purple fruit, a weird purple fruit whose hue is almost identical to sumire's hair color. Now, the other word for akebi is chocolate vine. Now, that's because only the outside of the akebi fruit is a weird magenta-esque purple, while the inside seems to bear chocolate-like seeds. Now, Borosumi concludes that's because sumire is supposed to be the outer shell to akebi. Sumire could be the magenta coating of the akebi fruit, while akebi would be the actual fruit inside. That is to say that the only reason that Amado is allowing for sumire to stay so close to him is because one day he wants to use her to reincarnate his daughter. I find this theory quite interesting. However, the only real problem I have with this theory, outside of the fact that the karma mark might already be on Delta 2.0, is the fact that Delta 2.0 should be a good recipient for the karma marking, and the fact that Delta is modeled after the exact looks of akebi, because Delta is a genetic copy of akebi who doesn't have akebi's soul, aka akebi's personality, which to me, if you're gonna go down the name route, is a bit confusing, because technically, if akebi is truly named after the fruit, then akebi should have some kind of purple aspects to her design. And really, the only thing purple about Delta is her eyes and the inside part of her cloak. But I do believe there is some possible likelihood to this theory, but I can't tell quite if that's coming from it being a well-formulated theory or just the fact that we know nothing about Amado. So I'm curious to hear from you guys. Why do you believe Amado is allowing Sumire to stick around him as a lab assistant? Do you believe he has ulterior motives, or do you think he just doesn't like doing the grunt work of all this science? Tell me in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Now, I just got told I was being weird at a party a month ago, and I don't remember being weird. I thought I was being completely normal, so I have to go hyperfixate on that for, oh, I don't know, the next 6 hours.